often I see the athletes who do most like mobility stuff before they can train, they're reminding themselves that they're in pain instead of just having that mindset of I can go into the gym and I can do my warm-up sets. If there is something that feels a little bit off, I have my toolbox of things I can do between my warm-up sets or whatever. You shouldn't feel like you have to do 45 minutes of mobility drills every time you go and work out.
The fitness movement is brought to you by Zor Fitness. We offer coaching and individualized program design, as well as educational content for coaches and athletes. It's all at one place, zorfitness.com. Today I have Kasper Vinther on the show. He is a physiotherapist and strength coach, and he owns Nordic Performance Training, which is located in Copenhagen in Denmark. Kasper used to work at a practice before actually deciding to open up his own facility. And since then, he's had the opportunity to work with everybody from the general fitness and health related client to people with aesthetic goals, all the way up to the people in the top tier of CrossFit, including Andre Houdet, who we talk about quite a bit in the podcast. Kasper has the reins of all of his strength training, and then Andre sort of works a lot of his CrossFit and conditioning work around that schedule. Just a little bit of context for the conversation, since we talk about Andre quite a bit. He finished top 5 in Denmark the past 4 years. In the last 2 years, he qualified for the CrossFit Games in 2021 and 2022. Today, we discuss a number of things, including why stability and creating high support through the setup of an exercise is so important to be able to express strength in a lift, how Kasper thinks about developing strength in a movement pattern, squatting strength or upper body pressing is two of the examples that we go over. Talk about the importance and the role of hypertrophy and that type of training for CrossFit athletes specifically, and how to go about that. And we get into the nuances of that as well. For example, like the role of lengthened versus shortened ranges of motion for taxing and biasing certain aspects of a muscle, and ultimately improving the strength and contractile potential. Also, how to think about exercise selection for developing that force potential, specifically to CrossFit athletes. We talk about how to develop strength without lifting maximally all the time. And lastly, how to improve your potential for strength production without just doing more of the same types of work. This is a great episode for anybody who's looking to bulletproof their body and express their best fitness. You can learn more about Kasper and his business if you go to nordicperformancetraining.com. He's in-person and remote training. You can also follow him on Instagram at Kasper Vinthers, as well as at Nordic Performance Training. I start off by letting Kasper know just how impressed I am with his English speaking abilities.
Sometimes it may be a little rusty in what we call it Danglish. So
Yeah, like a mix.
yeah, but yeah, exactly. Just sound like a Danish politician or something that's trying to talk at some top meeting. But I'll do my best.
No, I only ever speak English. I took a little bit of Spanish in high school, and it was terrible. It doesn't help when everyone around you speaks English. You don't ever really use it in conversation, but I'm still always impressed when people are bilingual or know a bunch of languages. So, you were a physical therapist, right? Or still are certified physical therapist.
Yeah, but my profession is a physiotherapist, and I do what I call physical therapist is probably what most people would just call like strength and conditioning training. But we have this like approach that's just centered around resistance training and an active approach. So we don't really have any. I think we're probably one of the only spaces of like physical therapists that don't have any like passive modalities, treatment modalities. We don't even have like a treatment table or anything. It's just all about being active, and everything is centered around like the gym environment. So trying to change it up.
Yeah. I'm kind of curious, like, did you feel like your schooling like set you up well to do what you do now and kind of, treat people in a more like functional approach? Did you feel like your schooling helped you with that, or was there like a learning gap at all?
Obviously, something has given me an advantage in terms of like just regular strength training. It gives you a knowledge base that's good in terms of also like ongoing education afterwards, just understanding like more like anatomy terms and all that kind of stuff. But in other ways, it's not always a good thing with like taking like here in Denmark, especially like PT, like the physical therapist education, because it's very focused on, as I talked about, like passive modalities and a lot of testing and finding diagnoses and all that kind of stuff, which can be great, but I think a lot of people like they tend to focus too much on those stuff and just instead of looking at the individual in front of them. And I think that's why people we have good outcomes because it's more about, we don't really see it like people as something that needs to be fixed, but more like yeah, that active approach we always take.
Yeah.
So in some ways, yeah, of course.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I feel like anybody who's coming out of, an educational background and going into a field, like you're just going to have a learning curve that happens naturally because no matter what, it's always your day to day, what you're actually doing and like your career is different than like, you have more of like a broad scope in education and then it gets narrowed down when you're actually day to day, like what you're doing more so.
Yeah.
At least that's like the way I've kind of thought about it.
When I worked as a physical therapist, like the way we work on clinics and all that kind of stuff back in the days, we see a lot of people. So the thing you really learn is just speaking to people and like it's more people skills than anything else. That's at least what I feel like is most valuable.
Yeah. So I heard you say before that you don't do like a lot of testing. You don't have like for example, like a movement screen that you take like new clients through. And it's more so just like you watching them as they're actually like doing their training, like you sort of get into training, or like that's at least how I interpreted what you said. Do you want to expand upon that anymore? Like what that intake process kind of looks like for someone that you're working with?
Yeah, so basically when people they come to us, we may have like an initial like consult where we of course we can do some form of testing, but it doesn't really have to be that traditional form of laying on a like a treatment table and testing range of motion, all that kind of stuff, or like trying to, because what we are educated in is like finding flaws,
Right.
which doesn't like it's a wrong term to say flaws, but that's what we like. It's biomechanical abnormalities or whatever.
Yeah, like a deficit.
Yeah, which often is completely irrelevant to test, and it's often a waste of time. We just need to like cover all, like if there is any red flags or yellow flags, that's what we call it, things we have to take seriously. If not, then it's a good change of pace for people to not get like when people come, if they have like some sort of pain issue or whatever, they've been to multiple other health care providers or physical therapists or chiropractors, whatever, and they've all been through the test several times, and everyone gets a different result. Um, so we do as little as that as possible, only when we feel like it's necessary, and then of course the training in and of itself is a movement screen. And the more it's like real training and not a movement screen, the more it's, in my opinion, a real movement screen. Because of course, as we go up in intensities and all that kind of stuff, we see, quote unquote, the real movement patterns that are like essential for what most people at least want to do or want to get back to doing.
Yeah. Yeah. And at least in my experience, like a lot of like pretty good athletes still have like, if you're to like laying on a table and take like the PT approach to things, like they'd have a lot of deficits or like deficiencies, like stuff that like a PT would be like, oh, I want to fix this. And it's like, certainly like that could have an improvement from maybe not even more injury prevention, but just like maybe from like movement economy or like getting them in the best positions. But oftentimes like those athletes still have like, they still can like figure out a way to move. And it's like the way that they've done it for so many years that it's like, if you try to unwind that, it often just causes more issues than if you just kind of, let them kind of move the way they naturally would.
Yeah, like the athletes, of course, they're like specialists in finding new ways to move. Like that's just because they're so like fluent in movement, so to speak. And so, of course, you can try and improve someone's dorsal flexion or whatever, like ankle mobility or whatever, or you can just teach them how to put them in a squat that forces them to the body to adapt to get those quads stronger and let the nervous system choose to move into dorsal flexion. But what I always for me, it's more about like the fragile mindset someone often gets from seeing multiple providers and getting a whole lot of different mobility drills and bandage stuff and all that kind of things because uh, you will experience pain sometimes if you're a high level athlete, but often I see the athletes who do most like mobility stuff before they can train, they're reminding themselves that they're in pain instead of just having that mindset of I can go into the gym and I can do my warm-up sets. If there is something that feels a little bit off, I have my toolbox of things I can do between my warm-up sets or whatever. You shouldn't feel like you have to do 45 minutes of mobility drills every time you go and work out. It's something I've heard from the clients I work with that responds well to this mindset, that when they get out of this mindset of having to do all their mobility stuff, it actually improves their sessions a whole lot. Also, like the whole, like, instead of wasting time laying on a foam roller on your mobile phone, you get to the gym, and that's the environment where you work out. It's not the environment where you do mobility drills.
Yeah, that's definitely something that I've noticed is the athletes who can just do like some specific mobility, like for example, if they're back squatting, do like a couple of different variations of, you know, getting into a squat basically, and then start actually doing the actual movement, like, and then building up and just doing the thing. Like if you can get used to doing that, like it seems counterintuitive, but almost like those people seem to have better longevity a lot of times in that movement. Whereas like the people like you're saying who are like really kind of use the whole, like I have to do all these activations and all these mobility drills and like all this, like, you know, long protocol things just to be able to get to the whatever, you know, say they're doing a strength move to be able to get to that. Yeah, they just like seem to, I don't know, they don't have as much longevity in my experience.
No. Yeah, and it's also for me, if you feel like you have to do those types of stuffs, it may be something like in your mentality, but it could also just be maybe we should look at the programming instead. Maybe it's a volume issue or a load tolerance issue or something. And of course, if you're a high level athlete, you need to have those tools if you're in competition. But like in the training season and earlier, you shouldn't have to do those types of stuff, in my opinion. But everyone is different, and it's about the coach and the athlete. I wouldn't, if someone has been doing that for a long time, I wouldn't just on the first session say to them, no, that's stupid. Why are you doing this? Just challenge that mindset after working together for a period of time and see if you can find like a common ground and try out something else, because sometimes it's that simple. Just don't do stuff that reminds you that you're fragile or the feeling of fragility.
So let's say you have an athlete and there's someone, for example, let's just say they're a CrossFitter, because that's a lot of people I work with. So it's an easy example for me. And you're just doing some of their strength and assistance work. Not just because that's a big part of the program, but let's say that you have somebody and they are that situation where that they have either joint stuff or they just feel like they have like this, you know, again, like a laundry list that they have to go through. What kind of factors, like you were saying, how like you could manipulate volume or intensity or start to prune back some of that stuff? How might you start to like manipulate those factors to start to move them in the direction that you want them to
go? It's a little hard to like. It depends on where they're at. Like how does everything look? Like I typically just move them as much as possible over to the way that I like to do it, because then I have like the framework from where we can change stuff going forward. And then of course like the movement quality and like the exercise selection, all that kind of stuff, I feel like it makes a huge difference, because as a CrossFit athlete, you tend to do a whole lot of volume, like no matter what. So being more efficient in what we're doing for the strength and the accessory bodybuilding type stuff, whatever, will have a huge impact on the total like amount of volume you're doing. And it may sound counterintuitive saying like we're working on hypertrophy, and the volume it goes down because a lot of people they feel like increase in volume is like the main driver of hypertrophy. But look like learning how to move more efficiently and having good exercise selection, we can actually perform less and get more effective volume, quote unquote. So it's a very multifactorial approach. It's not like just go lower the volume or whatever. But I
Right.
personally like it, when it comes to volume, I personally like to have it as the volume as quote unquote low as possible, but then focus more on intensity factors. But because that's what really that's the stimulus where we need. We just need to have enough uh, sufficient volume, and then we can always build it up.
Yeah. And often if it is someone who is doing something like CrossFit, they're doing so many contractions in the same patterns on a weekly basis already. And they've likely done that if there's someone who's more of a veteran athlete, they've been doing that for years. So just throwing more at them is only going to exacerbate problems that they have already. So you work with Andre Houdet, and maybe we don't have to use him, but we could say like someone like him, right? And I've heard him say that, like, for example, he really only tends to squat super heavy like once a week, and that's been a good frequency for him just because he's doing so many other squatting contractions in his like CrossFit training that's kind of a good frequency. Is that something that you kind of helped him arrive at, or maybe how you could just use him as an example? Like, how would you think about developing his squat in terms of volume and frequency throughout his week?
Yeah, so I think typically when CrossFitters they seek out help in terms of getting stronger, they might look more to powerlifting and Olympic weightlifting,
Yeah.
where we have a sport that's only centered around 2 or 3 lifts, and we know that frequency it's a very efficient tool in terms of getting good at certain movements. So they take a program. Let's say you squat at least twice a week, but maybe three, bench 3 or 4, and then you deadlift twice maybe. If you're doing CrossFit at the same time, it should be pretty obvious that it may be too much. And with some lifters mentality, they feel like they want to be better at something, so they just smash it very hard, and they like up the intensity, training close proximity to failure all the time. Where what I tend to do, or what we tend to do with high level CrossFit athletes, at least in the beginning, is somewhat the opposite. So we lower the frequency of a lift, and make sure that that's the primary day for, like, they have one primary day for that lift, where you need to be the strongest and have your highest amount of readiness and highest performance abilities. So as you mentioned with Andre, he normally has like one day that's dedicated to the squat pattern. That's his like primary squat day. Often we pair it with some presses, some delt work, and some quad accessory. But on this session, both the relative and the absolute loads will be the highest. And he knows that's the day that he has to come in fresh and perform. And let's say if you place that session on Monday, he of course has, the way he does it, he has his weightlifting session placed later. So already by having that, he has the squat pattern twice a week. So that functions in some way as a secondary day. So we might not even have to add any more squatting because he has the weightlifting, but we could add maybe a squat pattern with relatively low intensities, having like self-limiting variations in terms of load. So safety bar, pauses, power stuff, machine. So we can practice the movement, have a higher frequency of practice, but stay very cognitive about that. You still have fatigue left over from the primary session we did on Monday. So we're going to enter that session with a theoretically lower estimated 1 rep max, but that's okay because we don't have to push the intensities as much as we do on the primary day. So we manage fatigue levels, and make sure that he's as strong as possible on the primary day. And then we have that secondary day that induces less stress, but has the skill practice and a little bit more volume if we need it. And he's still able to recover, come back, and then peak on the primary sessions. So it's like the split you choose is in my opinion, extremely important. And there's a huge difference in, like, for me, I'm not an expert in CrossFit programming by any way, but it has to be a little bit different than what we do for like general population clients, which is what we before before I started work. Like Andre, he hired me to help him. That's all we worked with, and what the majority of the clients we help in our gym is, of course. So you might look at the training split and think it looks like an old school bodybuilding split. Like you have like three different sessions or four different sessions where you only have one muscle group. The frequency is mainly just once, and then you might have a secondary day, but very rarely do we have like tertiary days like you would if you were a high level powerlifter. Um, and also it's CrossFit, so you're not going to be a specialist in squatting. You just need to continuously get a little bit better, and having higher frequency takes away from you practicing other stuff. But yeah, everyone is a bit different. But in my opinion, from what I've seen for CrossFitters, it tends to work very well with that setup.
No, that makes a lot of sense to me. I mean, even for conditioning work, I've been going to like before I would never run like a single session progression for like energy systems training for somebody like, if I'm trying to improve their 2K row, like previously, like several years ago, like I wouldn't have ever run a progression that's like a 2K row progression, get that to them once a week. But if you're doing enough other conditioning work, it supports it where that one session becomes enough. And yeah, that totally makes sense as to why you're kind of going that route with things. So let's say if somebody is trying to improve like overhead pressing and they're a CrossFit athlete, if we just stick on that example, is it a similar thing where like one day you're probably focused on like their priority movement, which is like maybe more specific, maybe it's actually with like a barbell or something, and then it's maybe again like more of a secondary day to support that potentially down then like later on in the week, or would it be slightly different?
Uh, it can be both. Like if we go the route with like something like a three split or a quarter split, I will only have like the overhead press pattern once a week. We might have we can also use an upper lower split and then have some type of pressing twice a week.
Mm-hmm.
But again, like I would rather have them train it once a week and then see like slowly slow but sure progressions over a longer period of time, instead of course we could like what I've been doing a little bit more recently is if it's a weak point and they're not very good at the exercise, because someone like Andre, he moves very well in everything, and he learns it. He can do it like just do an exercise once a month and still be a pretty good mover. Like yeah, his movement coordination is on point almost no matter what. He just needs a few practice lifts on the same day, and then he's good to go. But with other clients, we may need to have something like so you can have like your primary session, and then on the secondary day we could do 50% and then just do more of a power variation, or like again just have that primary day be the high intensities, and then the relative intensities be lower on the secondary day. Being cognitive that our estimated 1 rep max is of course low on the secondary day, but we need to have some movement practice or stimulate a bit more hypertrophy if it's hard for us to get enough volume in on one session. So it's a little hard to come with like specific setups for it, but that's more the thought process I have is we have one primary session, then we can have one day where we just stimulate the high threshold motor units a bit and work on the movement coordination. But it's not a what we call a hot session made for like where we need the adaptations to happen or get stimulated. So I prefer to give CrossFitters 3 or 4 days a week where it's very adaptation focused, and then from all the other volume they're doing, I know that they're hitting stuff again, and they're probably hitting more than they tell me. So I know they get a bit of the stimulus anyway, without me having to program more even more sessions than those 3 or 4 weekly sessions, or even 2, for that matter of fact.
So to you, what role does like having exercise selection that's where like a muscle's in like a lengthened or shortened position? And maybe you could just give like a brief example of like what you mean by that. But like how might you, for example, one of the things you mentioned was like potentially reducing the volume by getting a little more specific with things. And I think that's maybe one of the things that you were alluding to. Like, what would be an example of that? And then how might you manipulate that into an athlete's week?
So yeah, in terms of the volume stuff, manipulating that, it depends a little bit on if it's hypertrophy work we're trying to incorporate, because that's become quite popular to like focus on, which makes a lot of sense because it sets you up for more success in the sport. Like if you look at like games athlete, you see you need to have some muscle on your frame. But when we like both in hypertrophy and strength, there's like a threshold of volume we often need to reach, but there are also diminishing returns when we get too far down the volume rabbit hole. So if we're training for strength, so now we're not really talking so much about the length and shorten part, but I guess we can just allude back to that. But of course we want more sets of relatively lower repetitions. The load being higher, but we stay further away from repetition failure, because each repetition is like the first repetition in a strength set, so to speak, is more stimulative than the last one because of the accumulated fatigue and because at the bar velocity starts to slow down. So total strength production capabilities that we are training in that movement becomes less and less as we get further into the session or into a set that's why we do back off sets and all that kind of stuff, where we make sure that we can keep a relatively high amount of force production on the set. But when we train for hypertrophy, it's a bit, you can see it a bit as the reverse, where we want to have enough repetitions that are relatively slow, because that's when we sense the most mechanical tension in the individual muscle fibers, which then stimulates to mechanotransduction to hypertrophy. And that's very costly in terms of recovery, because we tend to do that in more like lengthened exercises when we talk about hypertrophy, because that's where we can generate the most tension and we can get what's called stretch mediated hypertrophy. But it also comes with more of it comes with a price, like recovery wise, because it tends to lead to more mechanical trauma to the tissues we're training. And that's where we can start to not worry, but talk about which length we're training the muscles at. Because we have evidence that longer length are better for hypertrophy seen in isolation. But we also have evidence that suggests that shorter range exercises cause less CNS and peripheral fatigue and soreness. So we may move more of our like accessory movement, the volume we're doing there over to more shortened exercises, if you want to keep fatigue levels and soreness low. So, and that makes sense for even everyone from like beginners to advanced athletes. So beginners coming back from a vacation, whatever. We don't want them to wake up being too sore the next day. But athletes who are like getting close to competition, you're tapering, or you're just mitigating soreness, having those tools of moving more of your accessory to something that's hardest in the more shortened range can be pretty valuable. At least that's what we've been doing a lot with someone like Andre, who incorporates some like leg extensions, hamstring curls, all that kind of stuff to his training, instead of adding more accessory work that's hardest in the lengthened position as well, because he knows like the soreness, like you can perform if you're sore, of course, but it's a lot harder than if you feel more fresh. So I want him to leave each session still feeling pretty fresh when it's strength training, and come back to the next session feeling strong again. And as long as he gets enough volume in the lengthen he keeps on growing, then we're happy.
So could you give some more examples of like exercises of that might be in like a shortened versus lengthened position, just for people listening that they could maybe like visualize it?
So a classic example is something like a leg extension. So when it comes to the quads, it's very hard to train them where they're maximally contracted. So you're in a relative degree of hip flexion, and your knee is totally extended when you're at the top of a leg extension. So all the quadriceps muscles are completely contracted. So that's the most shortened range you can get in for the quads. It doesn't have to be the most shortened range when you're training. It's just we have like, it's a spectrum. But let's say, for example, if people are creating their own training program and they are training for, it could be either be strength or hypertrophy, and they have 6 sets of squats or whatever, instead of adding a sissy squat or some type of split squat that really targets the quads afterwards, you could incorporate leg extensions, because it's still going to work your quads. You're going to get some good stimulus, but it's way easier to recover from. And the same applies to something like hamstring curls. When you're lying hamstring curls, hardest tend to be, depends on like the machine you're using, tends to be hardest in the short position. So you can get a bit more volume there, like in relative to what you can do in a Romanian deadlift. As most people have done in like stiff-legged deadlift, they know they get sore if they push like only one set maybe, but you can do more sets of hamstring curls without getting super sore. So it's a way to get in more volume if needed, improve like proprioception and everything, just in the entire range of motion of the joint. And this is just from this is more like experience based, but doing like leg extensions, lateral raises that are like Y raises hard at the top, athletes tend to feel more like stable in their joints, catching stuff overhead. And if they have problems with the knee, front of the knee or whatever, I tend to use, and then we talked about movement assessments, just doing a set of leg extensions, see if they can extend the knee all the way up. If you're an elite athlete that can squat above hundreds of kilos, you should be able to extend your knee all the way off. If not, I see that's like something that we can, like a low-hanging fruit that we can improve.
Yeah.
And we don't really know the mechanisms why that should help, or if it's a placebo or whatever, but it's something that we could work on. Yeah.
It seems like a lot of, again, if I just go back to CrossFitters, because that's who I work with a lot, it's like, man, a lot of them lack the end range of motion, like you're saying, in the shortened position in particular. So when they're overhead, that last little bit of like actually having control of that range of motion, like same thing, like oftentimes with the amount of squatting that they're doing, like they don't get like that terminal knee extension as much. Certainly a lot of CrossFitters lack just hamstring strength overall. So like there's lots of things, like even hip extension, like you think with all the weightlifting that they do that they'd have great hip extension. A lot of them don't. So even like barbell glute bridges and things, oftentimes I'm starting to give a lot more of that kind of stuff, because it seems like just it helps make people a little bit more less susceptible to injury and just feel better and more stable, like you're saying, when they're catching weights and just moving. Gives them a little more longevity.
And we're not really sure, like I can't tell you why that is, but again, if I had like a big guy who snatches 130, he couldn't do a Y raise in a cable with the counterweight on the like the counterweight plate on the cable. Which, like, again, it's a simple way to increase like tolerance and maybe also confidence when catching. Like, it's just your nervous system gets used to being strong in the position that you want it to. So it's just the sum of all the parts you're looking at. and like that needs to carry over to the big compound lifts you're doing. And also uh, using Andre as an example again, when he's very efficient and doing all these quote unquote bodybuilding type stuff like leg extensions, Y raises, rows. If he comes into a session and he feels maybe a little bit beat up, either like he needs to get in the zone. Sometimes you're ready in this middle, like in the start of the session. Sometimes you need a little pick me up. He can just turn the session around and just start with the shortened type stuff first, as a way of just turning on the nervous system and get that out of the way, and you get a little pump, and that tends to make
Things
people
start feeling better.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The same as like doing hamstring curls before squatting. I use that a lot if people they complain about knee pain. Instead of trying to micromanage the joints and everything, do a bit of hamstring curls, a good squeeze at the top as you're warming up between your warm up sets, and see if that doesn't quote unquote fix the problem, and then you have that in your toolbox instead of like looking too much on tibial rotation and all that kind of like
Yeah,
stuff.
and I think if you have a more experienced athlete you're working with, you can start to play with those factors a little bit more. Like if you have someone who's been, exposing themselves to strength and endurance training the last decade, like, and they're kind of the case before, like where they're taking 40 minutes to get warmed up for their snatch session, you can kind of flip that around, give them some aerobic work at the beginning. They feel super warm and like their joints prep a lot quicker, and now they still can feel good when they actually go to do their strength work, and they can still express really well on that. But it's just a way of like switching things around so that they can still get productive training in and not just like quote unquote like waste a lot of time in the beginning of their session, but they're still not blunted that much when they actually go to express their strength work either.
Mhm. And I feel like it doesn't even have to be like quote unquote wasting time, because if you're training twice a day and you need to spend 40 minutes doing mobility work, you are pretty
Yeah.
much wasting time if you cannot do that. Like if you could use your preparation sets to get ready instead, and you would have more energy, and just use the preparation sets and the warm-up sets as your way to get ready as you get to your top sets or whatever. Doing too much before would just mask your like mask your performance too much, I think. And again, like when like confidence wise, I also remember him and other athletes telling me that at the games or at big competitions, seeing all the other guys on the last 2 or 3 days just foam rolling and stretching and doing banded stuff, and they feel great. Like they can do a bit of like they feel like they want to do some leg extensions and squats instead, because they know that makes them feel good, instead of having to do a whole lot of mobility drills all the time. They just warm up. Like that's crazy good for the confidence of an athlete going into the last days of competition, seeing everyone else feel beat up, but you just feel great because you like maybe it's also just because the way we structure the training, we use that accessory work to drive up their how much volume, like the volume tolerance. So often when people they progress volume, they start. Let's say you have 3 sets of 3 as your like top sets, whatever. People they go from 3 sets of 3 to 4 sets of 3, and then 5 sets of 3, and then 6 sets of 3. But from going from that to like just straight sets of 5 sets of 3, you have a million different ways you can progress volume by using accessory work instead. So you can still do your squats, maybe just a few sets, then you could do your hack squats afterwards as back off, and then you can use leg extension and other type of stuff to build even more tolerance over like a block of training. Then when you come back, then you can add, instead of adding a work like a top set more, you can just add a middle set or a back off set more, or more accessory work. Just keep doing that, and then at one point you can just add that extra set. So your volume tolerance has improved over, let's just say, half 6 months or a year, while others they follow that linear process of like, or they start at 5 times 5 at 85. And you may progress for 4 weeks, but as an elite athlete, you shouldn't be able to keep putting 2.5 kilo on the bar and keep progressing. Like, you need to find ways to progress further down the chain, in my opinion, before the prime work is progressed that much. So that may also be one of the factors that helps with the tolerance to more work.
Yeah. So in your mind, like, how important is like having an athlete's joint just like operate in the way it's supposed to, in like terms of like having all the planes of motion and being strong and like all those, versus like going down like the specificity route of just like, for example, like you gave if we just use the example of squatting, like you can practice barbell back squatting up to a certain point and you're going to get really good at that, but then there's like diminishing returns on that. So yeah, like how do you like balance those two and like think about keeping an athlete like well-rounded, being able to stay healthy and be able to use their joints in sort of like an anatomically correct way versus like fitting them into like what they're supposed to be doing for their sport?
Yeah. So again, the way we go about this for athletes is a bit different than just like general population clients, whatever. We always do our best to not fearmonger in any ways in terms of any movements, but being good at understanding, yeah, quote unquote, biomechanics, like exercise selection and finding ways to move that feels better for a joint, for example.
Yeah.
Again, let's just use Andre as an example again, because he's been very vocal about like everything he's been doing and all that kind of stuff. Um, he had a lot of like elbow problems, classic like CrossFit stuff with like tendinitis and chronic elbow pain, all that kind of stuff. If we were to just start him out with doing a shit ton of barbell presses, I'm not sure it would feel better for him. So we just move more volume to a the like a little bit further down the specificity chain, whatever. Like if the movement specificity is just doing that move, like the movement, because sometimes I also feel like specificity is just it's sacrificed for otherwise very good training methods, whatever. Doing a dumbbell shoulder press instead, or even a machine, if you have one that's very good, that works in like, let's say, scapular plane or whatever, that allows more range of motion, more power output because it's a more stable environment. It's more lengthened, it's more specific, it builds more muscle, that it feels better on the elbows. The fact that you get a lower sensation of pain, whatever, and you get more muscle mass, and you train in an environment where you can get more total force output and tension. When you get back to, say, barbell lifting again, you just need to practice the movement, of course, but then we often see that it has a huge carryover, and you can press more weight afterwards. So I'm not I like I know that we have to have the exercises that you're doing in the sport, but a hack squat is highly specific in practicing force production in the squat pattern, which will carry over to a regular squat. And a lat pull down is, in my opinion, very specific to practicing force output that looks something like a rope climb, builds massive lats. It's going to help you. And they're very easy to overload. Just like when you, and in my opinion, they're like, that's the basics. It's not, the barbell stuff is not the basics. And these basics have carryover to specific stuff, just as when you do a lot of simple, as you talked about, improving the row, like doing concept 2 machines, building aerobic base. It carries over into Metcons if you know how to do the skills, the necessary skills in the movement of the workout. Of course, you need to practice like combining exercises, all that kind of stuff, but it's very easy. It's much easier for you to overload aerobic base, or we'll do a V. That's why you do a V2 max test on a bike. You don't do it in a Metcon. Like it's easier to overload. And if you're a soccer player and you want to get in better shape, it's normal for them to use machines. It's not like you don't have to only play soccer to get better. It's just a matter of how you view exercise selection. And yeah, it all falls back to like increasing force production capabilities when we're speaking strength, finding exercises that are like quote unquote similar enough, like the same type of vectors that transfers to the specific sport environment, and then we can train both in like stable and less stable environments, and usually it carries over great.
Yeah. So if people don't follow you on Instagram, they should, because you post really good stuff all the time. But one of the things I've seen you post on there is like, it's just you pay relative to other people who I've seen just do like more strength accessory type stuff. You pay way more attention to the setups of lifts. You get way more intricate in how you think about helping an athlete create stability so that they can express power output really well. And is that just going back to like you want them to be able to produce the most amount of force possible in a given range? Is that why?
Yeah, so in terms of this the overall like setup, that for me that's the most important thing to learn if you're training people one-on-one. One of the most important like specific things you need to learn, because if you have a good setup, then everything like from the get-go, the movement is you don't really have to have a lot of cues besides like press hard and power and all that kind of stuff. You don't have to micromanage anything, because if you're in a good position from the start of the lift, the athlete is just gonna self-organize perfectly as they start to do more reps. But we we love using like, and one of the things that has caught a lot of like more like a lot, but some people's attention is that we use machines quite a lot, and we try to use exercises more stable, what people could refer to as like bodybuilding type stuff. And we incorporate external stability and a lot of different constraints. And so to answer why it's important to do this, it's a great idea to really let people understand what we mean by strength, because for me, strength is means producing force, and getting stronger means being able to produce more force than you were previously capable of. And if you're in stable exercises, they allow for you to use a high amount of both absolute and relative intensity. And in the movement patterns you want to quote unquote overload or train. And using a hack squat lets you practice like the ability of creating very high levels of force production in a very just appropriately constrained environment. It's still a squat, but because of the way the movement is set up, you cannot shoot your hips back, for example. It's very quote unquote squat specific. It makes it way easier to focus purely on your output, like the force output you do, and the intensity of your contractions, compared to if you're doing more complex non-constrained exercises like free weight movements, where something like a barbell squat would be on the other end of the spectrum if we were placing the hack and a barbell squat on like our own little theoretical continuum of squat patterns. And then remembering that like increases in strength is it's not like a physical adaptation, but it's more like the combined ability to express multiple adaptations. So it's easier to get those mechanical adaptations in terms of like more muscle mass, all that kind of stuff, if we can like log in and really make sure that it's the quads we're using, compared to if you're doing a free weight squats where if you train at high intensities, you will change the way you move, and you should, but it's just a different type of training. It's hard to overload the specific positions that we want to at high intensities, because things are going to change. Again, going back to like looking at movement screens and all that kind of stuff, you cannot tell how a person will squat with above 90% of their 1 rep max if you're just doing a air squat. It's still a fine thing to do, but just know that there are huge differences. So in my opinion, things like hack squat, all that kind of stuff. It's in seen in isolation is a better tool for the job of creating strength, because strength is essentially force production. And then we just need to find good ways to carry that over into the specific exercises and learn the movement coordinations and all that stuff from this quote unquote base of general strength training, or the basics, as I like to call it.
Yeah, and I would say you could probably argue that for a lot of athletes, especially people who have been around a while, they move well. You're saying like an Andre who, like, you know, he does a movement once a month and it's still pretty refined, like a couple warm-up sets and he's ready to go. Especially for people like that, it's like you don't need a ton more practice of the specifics. Like you just need a higher ceiling and, you know, to be able to train the right systems. So to constrain the movement, like you're saying, yeah, it allows them to express maximally their strength without having any technical breakdown that kind of just you could call it like maladaptation, basically, like not getting the thing that you want out of it. It just kind of it makes sure that you're able to get exactly what you want from a specific exercise to help it improve.
Yeah, and I think that, of course, it's like you shrugged a little bit when you said maladaptation, because it's like, but it's like movement wise, if you're constantly doing that type of stuff, you will learn how to move like that. And that's also why we don't peak every week, because there's a huge difference in doing an RPE 9 at above 90% than there is doing all your working sets at lower RPEs with quote unquote good tech, like the technique we want
Yeah.
for most of the stuff, and then just practicing the feel, like the soft skills and all the skill of having even higher load, where your form need to quote unquote break down, or you just need to change your the way you move, like your to lift the bar. So yeah, yeah.
Another thing that I've seen you give a lot of is, maybe not a lot of, but that you implement is like supported exercises. So for example, this is going to be really hard to explain over audio only, but for example, if you were doing like a preacher curl would be an easy example, right? Like your arm can't move backward in space, right? So if you're doing for example, like a barbell bicep curl, you have your back against a wall where your elbows can't travel back behind your body. Why would you give those types of exercises?
So I like that you used the curl, biceps curl as the as the example. Important exercise. But yeah, I people, they may joke a little bit about being focused on like the arm training we're doing, but like if you have a CrossFit athlete and they have quote unquote small arms, then they need to, like, they have room for them to get bigger. Why not? Because it will translate to a lot of the stuff you do in CrossFit, and you'll feel more resilient and can do more stuff. But we like to use both supported and unsupported variations. But when we use the supported, it's because we want more force output. The same example, like the same exact thing as when we talk about the hack squat. Whereas when we do it unsupported, it's more about creating that internal stability. It teaches you to do that, but when you have more support, it's the external stability we try to take in to get more force, total force output. And then it's also very good for hypertrophy work, as it's easier to like fatigue the tissues we want to in the positions that we want to, if it's more like locked in space, so to speak. But there's still some skill in learning how to use that external stability. And the funny thing is, using preacher curl, like just a single arm dumbbell preacher curl that's very well supported. If you have even someone who's on the level as an Andre and bigger guys, the top of the top, like having them train a set up biceps curl, like preacher curl to failure, they get pretty exhausted, because they're used to, like, good athletes are very good at quote unquote cheating, like in movement wise, because they know how to what do you call it, like movement economics, whatever. Um, but if you like that isolation stuff, just and it's not only CrossFitters, but everyone take like if you have muscle mass and you take a biceps preacher curl to failure, you will get out of breath. It's harder than people realize because most people are used to just having 3 sets of 15 dumbbell hammer curls at the end of the session and just standing there and swinging the dumbbells around. You might as well not do it, in my opinion. Why not have two very good sets, or even incorporate an arm day? Doesn't have to take more than 30 minutes into your weekly schedule. Then really focus on what you're doing, and then move on with your training week. And then I also hear that like it feels good on the elbows, all that kind of stuff, the shoulder joint. Like people, they tend to forget that the biceps and the triceps is a shoulder muscle. It crosses the shoulder joint. Having the nervous system feel strong and competent in different levels of shoulder flexion, extension, being able to create force and create internal stability in all those positions will carry over to your snatch and all that kind of stuff. I have no doubt about it.
All right, last question for you. So if you're gonna often like superset things, for example, say it's like a pressing and pulling, do you try to often line those things up where they're in the same plane? So for example, like a bent over row or like a cable low row with like a bench press, for example.
It when like pairing exercises like a push and a pull, there are a lot of things that we can take into consideration. Like, is the press variation where the shoulder girdle or the shoulder blade is pretty constrained, like it's like a barbell bench press, then we may think about using a pulling exercise where the shoulder blade can move more in space instead of having two exercises that are more biomechanically challenging, so to speak, just to get a bit of a balance. And I think I learned this principle from Stefan Cousseau from Kilo Strength. Like if he has a chin-up variation that's a little bit awkward in terms of like your grip, he may use a press variation that's more, you have more like movement freedom, so like the shoulder blade and everything can move better. So that's one way to think about it. You can also go more like the almost like N1 route where you very like fiber type, like fiber specific. So if you do a press for the clavicular pec, or maybe like a press around fly or something, you can think, okay, if I shortened that clavicular pec fibers to the upmost fibers of the chest, that's that's the position where my lowest lat fibers, the iliac lat, is lengthened. So you can do, instead of just being thinking agonistic, antagonistic superset being chest and back, you can think iliac lat and clavicular pec, and you can do the same. So if you're doing a dip, you're doing more like a high to low, a low to high row, and a high to low push. So you're pushing in the same plane. That's you could play around with that, but for most people, I'm not sure it really matters. But I'm glad that I know these types of exercises like press arounds that Kasim Hansen made famous, and because there may be like someone like Andre who he wants to be the best in the world, and if we see like the top of his chest, there are room for more muscle mass. He didn't really have a lot of that, so it's very easy to incorporate some clavicular work, and then behold, 2 years later, we have a wall-facing handstand push-up, and he feels like he's just like, yes, I like all the muscle mass he built. He can really, like, we talk about this often, like he feels like he can change from using more anterior delt clavicular because he's so good at the pressing angles. Like clavicular is more like narrow. Anterior delt, you go a little bit further out. And he just killed that workout. Like big, strong guys, like big shoulders, and he just flew past. And of course, he's also good at the Echo bike. But yeah. So like, why not? If if it's your job and your entire life is revolved around being the best athlete you can be, you can try to find those quote unquote weak points and try to improve them. And it's not because of aesthetics like a bodybuilder would do, but it's just make sure that you have muscle mass everywhere that can help you in the exercises you want to do. So yeah, and then one other example we had with it has nothing to do with this, like using the gym to work on the things that may carry over into competition. It's the same principle as playing around with like your rest intervals. We used to do like I think we did 10 sets of 2 hack squats in one session where we had 10-minute rest between each set. It sounds from a lot of people, it sounds like crazy long rest periods. But then again, go to Dubai like Dubai championships. They have clean and jerks with like he had like 15 minutes between lifts, and there's no stressing out because he's tried that at the gym. And now he's at the competition floor. He knows that he can like he actually performs better when he has like this long rest, and it makes sense because of the system we're training. But like CrossFitters are used to like EMOMs and all that kind of stuff instead of like really resting. So you can use the gym to make sure that you're used to like these scenarios that can happen in competition.
I love it.
And now we're speaking like very elite like type stuff. Like
yeah. I think you're gonna continue to get some good publicity as you should. I hope to see you continue to grow. I mean, the stuff you're doing is certainly unique, and it's not just unique, but it's like sound, like it's good.
Yeah, I don't feel like sometimes people think that I do stuff like very differently, but it's the print like it's still the same principles that like applying like just I feel like sometimes when it comes to like helping CrossFit athletes that I just give them what like makes sense, so to speak. It's like because if you
yeah,
I think if you like been in a like a method of training for so long, there may be pieces that you don't really see that are pretty easy to incorporate, and that's also the cool thing about CrossFit. Like every year, when I think athletes they reach out and learn stuff, like Andre is very good at, they incorporate it into their own programs, and it just expands very very fast in terms of like as like when like Chris Hinshaw came to like the aerobic stuff and all that. So it just evolves very fast and see how to find the best combinations for the sport. So yeah, but thanks for having me on. It was nice talking.
Thanks for listening today. If you're someone who just found the show, I would encourage you to subscribe so you can stay up to date. If you're someone who's been listening for a while and enjoying what you're hearing, I would encourage you to leave a rating or review for the show. It would definitely help us out. And lastly, if you're someone who does take your fitness seriously and cares about your performance deeply, I would encourage you to look into hiring one of our coaches. Until next time, stay the course.